In his preface to his classic text, The Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis suggests that there are two errors we can fall into regarding the devil. One is to have absolutely no interest, and the other is to have too much interest. In other words, to deny Satan's existence and to pay him too much regard are both mistakes. Even so, the passage from Matthew today invites us to think about Satan, if for no other reason than the fact that Jesus calls one of his apostles by that name. So we have to ask why, and what did he mean by that? Many people give Satan all the credit for everything that goes wrong in the world, almost elevating Satan to a place equal with God, as God's opposite. But it's worth noting that the scriptures are adamant that there is only one God, and that God's place as creator and as ruler is unassailable. Earlier in Matthew, and if you can recall this from last week's passage, Jesus had asked his apostles who people were saying he is. And while the others kind of just repeated what they'd heard, oh, he's John the Baptist, or he's Elijah, or a prophet, Simon Peter blurts out, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." Even though, as Albert pointed out last week, there was a lot of Messiah promoting and posturing at that time. There were false messiahs popping up everywhere. Peter still took a big risk in identifying Jesus as so. To Romans, Messiah, meaning the anointed one, points to a king's coronation. So claiming a royal title, especially commoners like Simon Peter and Jesus, was treason against the Roman Empire. For all intents and purposes, Simon and Jesus were both committing treason in front of witnesses. But Jesus praised him, saying, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." And then Jesus went on to change Simon's name to Kephas, Aramaic for rock, which in Greek is Petros, where we get the name Peter. This was a turning point in the life of the disciples and in the flow of this narrative, as Jesus transitions from teaching and healing to intentionally identifying that he is on his way to death and sacrifice in Jerusalem. And he is preparing the disciples to transition from being his students and followers to being themselves the bearers of the gospel, to being themselves true believers and true leaders and teachers. Granting someone a name the way that Jesus did to Peter was something really special. Nowadays, it's oftentimes people will give a name just because they like the sound of it, and they look for its meaning afterwards. But in many cultures, names were and still are considered important, not only in identifying characteristics, but in creating them. And this is significant in this week's gospel story. Jesus' way of transitioning himself and his followers toward the reality of his identity as the suffering, persecuted Messiah, and theirs in turn as his witnesses, was to talk out loud about it. I must go to Jerusalem, and I must suffer, but I will be raised on the third day. How well the disciples understood the full content of his speech is unclear, but it clearly distressed Peter, who had the courage to speak up to Jesus and to tell him to stop talking like this. Generally, though, those who speak up to God don't get scolded. They're not struck by lightning and turned into a pile of ash. Job speaks out against God, insisting he doesn't deserve what has happened to him. He even cries out that he can't get a fair hearing in God's court. Abraham argues with God about the impending destruction of Sodom and talks him down to saving the city if only 10 just people can be found. And Moses scolds God for his intention to destroy the people in the desert, claiming it will give God a bad name among the nations. Prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah argue that they are not up to being God's representatives. But when Peter criticizes his master, Jesus lashes back at him. "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind on not on divine things, but on human things." It's pretty startling, isn't it? Did Peter, kind of bumbling, not so bright, earnest Peter, really deserve such harsh treatment? What did Jesus really mean by calling Peter Satan? The idea of the one that we think of as a fallen angel is missing from much of the Hebrew scriptures. The word Satan is more of a title in them, the Satan. It is often translated as adversary. And when we encounter Satan, for instance, in Job, he seems to belong in the heavenly court and has the important job of challenging God. Far from casting him out, God answers Satan's charges against Job and even gives him the power to attack Job's possessions and his person to try to prove that God's praise for Job is poorly founded. In Zechariah, Satan is once again found in the heavenly court, acting as a prosecuting attorney to accuse the high priest. And to some extent, this is the Satan that we meet in the temptation of Jesus' account earlier in Matthew's gospel. Some of what Satan tempts Jesus to do is not intrinsically evil. He encourages him to do the very things that Jesus has come to do anyway, but by taking the easy way, not the difficult way of the cross. Jesus came to feed the hungry, but the first temptation is for Jesus to feed himself. Jesus came to do great wonders, like healing the sick and casting out demons that plagued people emotionally, and raising the dead. But Satan tempts Jesus to excite wonder by casting himself off of a high tower and landing safely, kind of like a circus act or an attraction at the Dutchess County Fair. And as the Son of Man came to reign eternally, Satan tempts him to do so painlessly, effortlessly, instead of through the difficult path of the innocent who bears abuse without complaint and heads to the cross. So maybe it makes sense that, having just told his followers that he would suffer and he would die and be raised again, Jesus would identify Peter with the adversary, the same one who had already offered him the kingdoms of the world the easy way, by a shortcut, by one that would supposedly achieve God's will. Jesus went on to instruct all the disciples that being a true follower meant that we must take up our cross and follow him. Our faith, far from protecting us from harm, may very well open up ourselves to persecution and to suffering from political and even religious authorities. We're so used to thinking, perhaps, that our faith in God embraces our attachments, our country, our family, our job, our sports teams, our possessions, and our pastimes. So it is jolting. It is kind of a conundrum when a moment comes where we actually have to make a choice between the things that we love and support and faithful living in Jesus. They're not always the same. For example, and this is really mundane, so pardon me, the purpose of a church pension fund is to make as much money as possible for church workers, pastors, and staff, and still, the fund managers may very well make decisions about their investments based on the church's faith stance. Choosing not to invest in certain businesses might mean that their clients will not have as large of a pension fund. But no one said that the way of Christ is easy. Or another example that I've encountered with my students is taking any kind of a service trip that has impact and effect, like the Midnight Run. And by the Midnight Run, I don't mean, it's not an athletic event. It's a way to drop off and provide food and shelter for homeless people. It's an organization that networks, it's based in Manhattan, it networks schools and organizations and churches on a schedule of drop-offs of food and clothing at points around New York City. The runs happen at night between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. And when we take a midnight run, we bring a busload of food and clothing, and at each designated drop-off, usually there are 4 to 5 places that we go to, from the Lower East Side all the way up to the Upper West Side, we meet clients there. We meet people who live on the street, who have few resources to survive, and we serve them and we talk with them at a time that is most advantageous and helpful for them, not for us, at midnight. We usually get home around 3 or 4 in the morning. There's no negotiating the stops or the timing or the date. There's no stopping for Starbucks lattes along the way because the organization and the clients depend on us. When we don't show up at the time and place appointed, we hear about it from Dale, the director, and we know how many people we have let down. The kids are definitely forewarned that this is hard work. We don't get any sleep. We won't be comfortable. It's dirty. It can be scary for some kids. And even with this warning, some of the kids are surprised by the level of discomfort and don't sign up to do it again. But the vast majority get it, and they sign up and come again and again. And you can imagine why they get it, how they have, in a very tangible way, in the company of others in the group, overcome their attachments and met face to face with a person in need, met face to face with the injustices and poverty of street life, and connected with other human beings, outsiders, with their love and their care. That space to which Albert last week referred to as in between, that space of being in this world but not of it. When Jesus began to focus on the cross, he didn't stop healing and teaching, and nor are we to cease offering a cup of cold water when someone is thirsty, when we take up our own cross and follow Jesus. And suffering may very well be a part of our path, but other things happen. We shouldn't be surprised that God expects and loves us such that we will continue to serve in his name despite our own struggles. It's also important to watch that we don't offer our fellow believers an easy way out, thinking that we're being kind. True kindness is facing the demands of discipleship squarely and with shared courage, because no matter where the road leads, it ends in glory. Don't forget, Jesus didn't just say that he was going to suffer, he also told the disciples that he would rise again. The lesson for us is not that we should continue to look for opportunities to suffer or deliberately choose the hard way, but that the way of discipleship is the one to which God calls us. Not all of it will be necessarily hard, and much of it will be surprisingly, deeply strengthening and fulfilling. But if we find it all easy, we should examine ourselves to see if we are truly following Jesus. Instead, simply say, "Here I am." Amen.